The deepest point in the Mariana Trench is called Challenger Deep. It sits in the western Pacific Ocean, approximately 340 kilometers southwest of Guam, and it is 10,935 meters below the surface of the sea. To put that number in terms the human body understands rather than just the human mind, if you dropped Mount Everest into Challenger Deep, the summit would sit more than a mile beneath the waterline. The pressure at the bottom is 1,086 times the pressure at sea level. The temperature is just above freezing. There is no light. There has never been light. Whatever lives down there has never seen the sun and never will, and has built itself entirely around the fact of permanent, total darkness. We have sent things down there: probes, cameras, unmanned submersibles with lights attached, small suns we lower into the dark on cables. What they show us every time is the same thing: a flat gray landscape of sediment, soft and undisturbed, stretching in every direction. Occasionally something moves across the frame, something pale, something slow, something that has evolved in a place with no predators and no competition and nothing to run from, and so has forgotten over millions of years what urgency feels like. In 2031, we sent something else. The project was called HODL 7. It was the 7th iteration of a deep-sea survey program run jointly by 3 oceanographic institutes and funded, in part, by a defense contractor whose name appeared on the budget sheets, but not on any of the public documentation. This is common in deep-sea research. The ocean floor is the last place on Earth that is genuinely, legally, practically ungoverned, and the organizations that fund exploration of it are not always interested solely in science. HODL 7's stated objective was comprehensive acoustic mapping of the Challenger Deep Basin, specifically the creation of a full 3-dimensional sound map of the trench using a new generation of low-frequency sonar that could resolve features as small as 2 centimeters at depths where previous technology had managed only 2 meters. In practice, this meant they could see everything: every rock, every ridge, every impression in the sediment left by anything that had ever rested there. The team was small. A chief scientist named Dr. Yua Matsuda, who had spent her career studying acoustic anomalies in deep water environments and who had published papers on what she called subsurface resonance, the way certain geological formations produce sound, very low sound below the threshold of human hearing that can travel thousands of kilometers through water. A technician named Rourke, who handled the equipment and who was, by all accounts, the kind of person who functions best when there is a procedure to follow and deteriorates when the procedure stops applying. 2 data analysts working remotely from a facility in Honolulu who processed the acoustic data in near real time and whose names I've been asked not to include in this account. And a 4th person on the ship whose role was listed in the project documentation as observational consultant and who I will call Dr. Feist, because that is not his name and he has asked me specifically not to use his real one. I spoke to Dr. Feist for 11 hours over 3 days in the spring of 2033. He is the reason this account exists. He is also the reason I have not slept properly since April. The ship was called the Petrel. She left Guam on a Wednesday in March and reached the survey coordinates 4 days later. The weather was calm. The Pacific in that region at that time of year can be shockingly gentle, a fact that Dr. Feist mentioned several times during our conversations, as if the calmness of the sea was itself a kind of provocation. The first deployment went normally. The acoustic array was lowered to 2,000 meters and the initial calibration sweeps were run. The data came back clean. Matsuda was pleased. Rourke ran his checks and found nothing wrong with anything. The Honolulu analysts reported signal quality significantly above expected parameters. Everything was working better than it should, which in research is usually a sign that you haven't yet found out what you're measuring wrong. On the second day, they lowered the array to 6,000 meters. Still clean, still better than expected. On the third day, they went to 9,000 meters, within range of the deep basin floor. The data that came back from the 9,000 meter sweep was processed overnight in Honolulu. At 4 a.m. on the 4th day, one of the analysts called the ship. Dr. Feist was awake. He had, he told me, found it difficult to sleep since arriving at the survey site, for reasons he couldn't identify at the time. He described it as a feeling of proximity. not proximity to the ship's crew, proximity to something below, as if the depth between the hull and the bottom was not the vast insulating distance it appears on a chart, but something more like a membrane, something thinner than it looks. He was on deck when Matsuda came to find him. Her face, he said, had the expression of someone who has been given information they're still deciding what to do with. She showed him the acoustic map on her tablet. The floor of the Challenger Deep Basin at 9,000 meters was as expected. Flat, sediment-covered, featureless in the way that absolute extremity tends to be featureless. The sonar had resolved it at 2-centimeter accuracy, which meant that every depression, every ripple in the sediment, every impression left by any creature that had ever crossed that gray landscape was visible. What was not expected were the marks. They covered the basin floor in a pattern that extended to the edges of the sonar range and presumably beyond. Regular, spaced, precise in the way that only two things in nature are ever truly precise: crystal formation and intention. They were circles, each one approximately 3 meters in diameter, spaced 6 meters apart, center to center, in a grid that covered every mapped area of the floor. Hundreds of them, thousands beyond the sonar range, not impact craters. The sediment was pressed down, not thrown outward. Something had rested on the floor at each of those points. Something roughly circular, roughly 3 meters across, had settled into the sediment and then, or this was the interpretation that made Matsuda's face look the way it looked, lifted off again. Something had been standing there, Dr. Feist told me. That was the only way Matsuda could frame it. Standing. Whatever made those marks had been standing on the bottom. In a grid. The whole floor, as far as we could map it, was covered in places where something had been standing. I asked him how old the marks were. He said, "That's the part Matsuda couldn't tell us. The sedimentation rate at that depth is about 1 centimeter per 1,000 years. The marks were clean, no infill. Whatever made them had been there recently." I asked him what recently meant. He looked at me for a moment. He said, "The sediment was still settling when the sonar hit it. The displacement was still in motion. Whatever made those marks had been standing there when we arrived. It moved when the sonar reached it." Matsuda made the decision to lower the array to the full depth, 10,935 meters, the bottom. Rourke argued against this, not on technical grounds, the equipment was rated for the depth, but on grounds he struggled to articulate, which Dr. Feist told me he recognized because he was feeling the same thing, a resistance, a physical reluctance that presented itself as logic. We should process the 9,000-meter data first, we should wait for better weather, we should consult the university. But was underneath something simpler and older than logic. He did not want to send a light down there. Matsuda overruled him. She was the chief scientist. It was her project. She had the face of someone who has waited their entire career for a data set like this and is not going to stop now because of a feeling she can't justify. The array went down at 1400 p.m. on the 4th day. It took 40 minutes to reach the bottom. During those 40 minutes, the Petrel was quiet, in a way that Dr. Feist said was different from ordinary shipboard quiet. Everyone was where they needed to be. No one was talking. The acoustic monitors in the survey bay were running, processing the signals that came back as the array descended, and the sound they made, the translated, speaker-rendered version of what the sonar was hearing on its way down, was like breathing. Long, slow, low. The water itself seemed to be breathing around the cable. At 14:41 p.m., the array reached the basin floor. The image resolved on the monitor over the course of about 30 seconds, the way a photograph develops, detail emerging from gray, the basin floor, flat, sediment, and empty. No marks, no circles, no impressions in the sediment. The floor at the very bottom was completely undisturbed, smooth as a swept floor, as if nothing had ever rested there. Rourke said, "Where did they go?" Matsuda didn't answer. She was looking at the acoustic data, not the visual feed, the numbers coming back from the array's sound sensors. Dr. Feist looked at the visual feed. He looked at the smooth, unmarked sediment. He thought about the marks at 9,000 meters, circular, 3 meters across, spaced in a grid, standing. He thought about the fact that the basin floor is deeper than 9,000 meters, that whatever had been standing at 9,000 meters had not been standing on the bottom. It had been standing in the water column, in the water, in the dark, in the pressure, in the cold, at 9,000 meters, in a grid that covered the entire basin. It had not been resting on the floor. It had been hovering above it. Matsuda called everyone to the survey bay at 1500 p.m. The acoustic data from the full-depth array was unlike anything in the research literature, not because it showed something unexpected, because it showed the opposite of something expected. At full depth, in the deepest point of the deepest trench on Earth, the acoustic sensors were returning almost total silence, not the silence of an empty space. Dr. Feist was careful to explain this distinction to me, and I have thought about it many times since. An empty space returns a particular kind of acoustic signature, the sound of distance, of depth, of water moving against itself. The silence the sensors were returning was different. It was the silence of absorption, the silence of a space where sound goes and does not come back. Something in the basin was absorbing the sonar, not the geological formation, not the sediment, something in the water column. Something distributed, spread throughout the basin, present at every point the array could reach. It was like trying to map a room, Dr. Feist told me, and discovering the room is full of something that doesn't reflect light. You can tell it's there because of what you can't see. The shape of the absence. Matsuda was very still while she explained this. She pulled up a 3-dimensional rendering of the basin on the main screen, showing the acoustic returns, or rather, showing the absence of acoustic returns, as a volume, a shape defined by silence. The shape filled the basin from the sediment floor to approximately 4,000 meters above it. It was not uniform. There were variations in density, areas of greater absorption and lesser. When rendered in 3 dimensions, color-coded by absorption intensity, it looked... Dr. Feist stopped here in our conversation, looked at the table between us. When he looked up, he had the expression I had come to recognize over 11 hours as the expression he got when he was deciding whether to say something accurately or safely. He chose accurately. He said, "It looked like something that was aware it was being looked at. I know that's not a scientific description, but that's what it looked like, something that had changed its position or its orientation in response to being observed. The densest part of it, the most absorptive, was facing the array, the way an animal turns to face a sound. They should have pulled the array up and left. I've thought about this many times, about how many moments there were in those 4 days where a different decision would have meant a different outcome. Matsuda was not reckless. Rourke was not stupid. Dr. Feist is, from everything I observed across 11 hours of conversation, one of the most cautious and methodical people I have encountered. None of it mattered, because the array stopped responding at 16:23 p.m. Not a cable failure. The cable was intact, tension normal, signal carrier operational. The array itself simply stopped transmitting. No error code, no shutdown signal, no indication of mechanical failure. It was there, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, connected to the ship by 10,935 meters of cable, and it had stopped doing anything. Rourke ran every diagnostic available to him. Everything showed green. The array was functioning. It had simply stopped sending data. They waited. At 1700 p.m., Matsuda ordered the winch to begin retrieval. The winch ran for 30 seconds and stopped. Not a mechanical fault. The motor was running. The drum was turning. The cable was moving. The array was not coming up. The cable was going taut in the downward direction. Dr. Feist told me he felt something change in the ship when this happened. A shift in the Petrel's movement, the way she sat in the water, as if something below had taken hold of her through the cable and was making itself felt, not pulling, not yet, just present, making its weight known. Rourke cut the cable at 17:12 p.m. This was the correct decision. Dr. Feist believes it was the decision that meant the Petrel was able to leave at all. They left the site at 6 p.m. The journey back to Guam took 4 days. Dr. Feist told me those 4 days were the longest of his life. Not because anything happened, nothing happened, but because of the quality of the silence that followed them. He stood on the deck at night and watched the water behind the ship and felt, the entire time, that the distance between the Petrel and the survey site was not increasing. That whatever was in the basin was not stationary. That 340 kilometers of open ocean is not the barrier it appears on a map. He told me about one moment on the third night of the return journey. He was on deck, alone, at around 2 a.m. The sea was flat. The moon was bright enough to see by. He was looking at the water behind the ship, and he noticed, at the edge of the moonlit surface, a disturbance, a movement, very slow, very large, something that lifted the surface without breaking it. The way a very large object just beneath the waterline displaces water when it moves, a shape defined by the displacement around it, the way you can read the shape of something invisible from what it does to the space beside it. He watched it for a long time. It moved parallel to the ship, perhaps 100 meters off the port side, and then it didn't. It was there, and then it wasn't. The surface returned to flat. He went back to his cabin and lay down with his eyes open and thought about the acoustic map, about the shape defined by silence, about the part of it that had oriented itself toward the array, toward the light they'd sent down, toward the sound they'd made in the dark. About how something that has spent millions of years in a place with no light at all would understand, when a light appeared, exactly where that light had come from, exactly where the cable went, exactly where the ship was. The project data was classified 4 weeks after the Petrel returned to Guam. Dr. Feist was asked to sign a document he described as comprehensive and was told that the acoustic anomaly had been reviewed and attributed to equipment malfunction. He signed the document. He told me he signed it because the alternative was being the person who explained to the world what was in the Mariana Trench, and he was not sure the world was ready for that explanation. I asked him what the explanation was. He thought about this for a long time, long enough that I thought he had decided not to answer. Then he said, "The Mariana Trench is 10,935 meters deep, and we have explored less than 1% of it. We have a complete map of the surface of Mars. We have charted every mountain range and river delta and ice shelf on Earth. And the deepest point in our own ocean we have visited exactly a handful of times, with equipment that can barely function at that pressure. And each time we go, we see a flat gray floor and something pale moving slowly at the edge of the light. And we come back and we say, there is nothing down there of significance." He stopped. Then, what if we say that because the alternative is acknowledging that there is something down there of enormous significance, and that it has been there for longer than we have existed, and that every time we send a light into that dark, we are doing the same thing a very small animal does when it wanders into a very large cave and lights a match to see? We can see by the match. The match shows us what's immediately around us. But the match also shows us to everything in the cave that was already perfectly comfortable in the dark. I asked him if he thought it would come up. He looked at me. He said, "I think it already has. I think it has been coming up for a long time. I think the reason we find so little when we look at the deep ocean is that the deep ocean, whatever is in it, has learned how to not be found. And I think the reason it has learned that is the same reason any animal learns to move quietly." He picked up his coffee, put it down without drinking from it, because it is hunting. I have sat with this account for 8 months before writing it down. I have checked Dr. Feist's credentials, his presence on the Petrel, his affiliation with the Institute. Everything verifies. I have found 3 other references in the scientific literature, oblique, careful, buried in footnotes, to acoustic anomalies in the Challenger Deep Basin that match what he described. Each one attributed, in the published version, to equipment malfunction. There are things that are easy to know and hard to live with. I have spent my career working in that space, and I thought I was comfortable there. I thought I had made my peace with the fact that the world contains more than it shows. I live on a coast. I have lived on this coast for 12 years. I walk on the beach most mornings. I look at the water. I have been thinking, since April, about what Dr. Feist said, about the animal in the cave with the match, about the patience of something that has lived in the deepest dark for longer than our species has existed. about how it has had millions of years to learn the difference between the lights that descend on cables and go back up again, and the lights that stay, the lights on the shore, the lights of houses and cities and roads arranged along the edge of the water, visible from the surface on a clear night, visible from below on a clear night too, I would imagine. A warm glow through the water, something that has always been there as far as whatever is down there is concerned, a landmark, a fixed point, a place that does not move. I've been thinking about this for 8 months. I still walk on the beach in the mornings, but I have stopped going at night, and I have stopped looking at the water. And sometimes when the tide is very low and the sea is very flat, and there is enough moon to see by, I think about what Dr. Feist saw from the deck of the Petrel at 2 a.m. on the third night of the return journey. The displacement on the surface, the shape defined by the water moving around something that wasn't there. I think about how large that displacement was. I think about how slowly it moved. I think about how, when it was gone, it did not move away. It submerged.